It all started early in our marriage when Darcy and I were still navigating how to coexist under one roof. We were two young souls attempting to juggle love and the grind of daily life. Back then, we celebrated small victories like purchasing our first home, raising two lively boys, and settling into a comfortable suburban routine. But as the years went on, the cracks in our picture-perfect life began to show. Darcy had always been the adventurous one, constantly chasing new experiences, while I preferred the predictability of routine. As these differences deepened, so did the distance between us. I poured myself into work and fatherhood, while Darcy seemed drawn to something beyond the world we had built together. One quiet Sunday, I found myself wandering aimlessly through a hardware store. I should have been at church, I suppose, but browsing shelves of tools felt more appealing. I didn't need anything in particular, but it beat wasting the day on a golf course. As I strolled the aisles, I bumped into Wes Dorman, a family acquaintance. We weren't especially close, but we'd had our fair share of casual chats over coffee. It just so happened that his wife Leona and my wife Darcy were set to leave for a week-long Caribbean cruise the following morning. Since Wes couldn't get time off from his job, Darcy had insisted I stay home with the kids, saying I'd only be a third wheel and that the two women could save money by sharing a cabin. I wasn't thrilled but figured it wasn't worth the argument. "Are you heading out on that cruise tomorrow?" Wes asked as we stood by the pest control section. "Not me," I replied. "Darcy said you couldn't get off work, so here I am on kid duty." Wes squinted, confused. "I work for my uncle, Hal. I can take off whenever I want." I was ready to go, but Leona told me you couldn't make it. An awkward silence settled between us until an elderly man in a motorized cart grumbled for us to clear the aisle. I glanced at Wes, a sinking feeling stirring in my gut. "Feel like grabbing a coffee?" I asked. "Yeah, let's do that," he said with a shrug. 2 hours later, we sat in a corner booth at McDonald's with fresh cups of coffee and a couple of apple pies. It didn't take long for us to piece it together. Our wives had planned a cruise without us, and it didn't feel like it was for the sake of girl time. The unspoken question loomed between us until I finally asked, "So, Wes, you think they're meeting guys on this cruise, or do you think they've already got someone lined up?" Wes rubbed his face, clearly uncomfortable. "Want another pie?" he said, stalling. But after a moment, he added, "I doubt Leona's out there looking for random guys. If anything, it's something already arranged." I nodded, the pit in my stomach growing. "Yeah, that sounds about right. Otherwise, why go to all that trouble? They could meet someone local if that was the goal." We stared out the window for a while, watching the parking lot traffic. Wes eventually broke the silence. "Both of them work at Tri-Point Casualty Insurance. It's probably guys from work." His words hit me like a bucket of ice water. "If they're bold enough to take a whole cruise with them, I'm guessing this didn't start last week," I muttered, bitterness lacing my tone. "You think they've already crossed that line?" Wes asked quietly, his eyes fixed on the table. I didn't want to answer, but I didn't have to. We both knew. Wes exhaled sharply, got up, and returned with a glass of ice water he'd bought for 30 cents. He poured it into our scalding coffee, stirring slowly. "Leona's been working late a lot lately, evenings, weekends too. I didn't think much of it before, but now it's hard to ignore." "Same with Darcy," I admitted, swallowing the bitterness. "But I'm not about to sit around like a fool while she's off living it up." "Agreed," Wes replied, a fire in his eyes. We made a plan to meet the next morning at the same McDonald's after the women left for the airport. Before we parted ways, I told Wes to stay quiet. "Don't say anything to Leona. If they know we're onto them, it's game over." "Got it," he said, giving me a thumbs up as I headed home. Back at the house, everything seemed normal. Our boys, Reed, 7, and Jalen, 10, were glued to the TV. I'd fought the go-play outside battle for years and finally waved the white flag. Darcy was in the kitchen making a late lunch, moving around with her usual energy. You'd think a woman about to leave for a week-long trip might mention it, but she didn't say a word about the cruise. Odd, and definitely suspicious. After we ate, I took the boys outside to kick around a soccer ball while Darcy busied herself packing. She was laser-focused on making sure her bags were ready for a smooth departure in the morning. While I played goalie for the boys, I found myself glancing at the house. How had I missed the signs? How had I been this blind? "Reed, Jalen," I called out. You guys are going to stay with Grandma and Grandpa Mollis next week while I paint the house. They didn't even argue. In less than 10 minutes, they'd packed their bags and were waiting by the front door. My parents' farm was only a half-hour away, and it had horses. Easy sell. Darcy grumbled a bit when she heard, but she didn't fight it too hard. Later that night, she announced she wanted to turn in early to get a good night's sleep before the trip. That was my chance. While she showered, I checked her bags. I wasn't proud of it, but something in my gut told me I'd find something. I did. Her sleepwear was different than usual, not what you'd expect for a trip with a friend. Then I found a brand new orange bikini tucked inside her makeup bag. But the kicker? A box of 20 condoms hidden away at the bottom of her suitcase. I stared at them for a long time, my head pounding with disbelief and anger. Back in the living room, I watched TV long after she went to bed. Darcy had international phone coverage through her work plan. I didn't. She promised to check in daily, but I wasn't feeling so trusting anymore. The next morning, I dropped her off at the airport. Leona was already there, waving with a big smile. Darcy didn't hesitate, just walked over and hugged her. No goodbyes longer than necessary. I met up with Wes as planned. He had 2 coffees in hand and a grim look on his face. "Tell me you found nothing," he said. I shook my head. She packed lingerie, a bikini, and a stash of condoms. Wes's jaw clenched. Leona had 2 new dresses and, yeah, same thing. Condoms. Unbelievable, I muttered. I didn't even think to check her makeup bag at first. If I hadn't, I wouldn't have seen them. For 20 minutes, we sat there, letting the weight of it sink in. Then it was time for action. Our first stop? Tri-Point Casualty Insurance, where Darcy and Leona both worked. We asked to speak with Glenn Forsyth, the head of HR. We'd known him since high school. Not a friend, but someone we could approach. When Glenn walked into the room and saw us, his face dropped. "Shut the door," he said flatly. "Know why we're here, Glenn?" Wes asked, sitting down. "I've got a pretty good guess," he muttered, eyes locked on his desk. "How many employees are on vacation this week?" I asked. "Is that a question, or a request?" Glenn replied, his eyes narrowing. "It's both," Wes said firmly. Glenn sighed, tapped at his keyboard, and muttered, 14 employees, including Darcy and Leona. "Can you print that list for us?" Wes asked, leaning forward. Glenn sighed, typing in a few more commands before the printer whirred to life, spitting out 2 sheets of paper. He handed them to us, his eyes watching closely for our reactions. I glanced at the names on the list, and one name stood out, Clayton Rusk. Another caught my attention just as fast, Calvin Bostic. My heart sank as I nudged Wes. We scanned the page together, our eyes locking in silent recognition. "These 2 are on the same cruise as Darcy and Leona," I muttered, folding the paper in half. "We don't need to see the rest of the list. That's all we need to know." Wes leaned forward. "Out of curiosity, do you know the room pairings?" Without a word, Glenn reached into his desk, pulled out 2 photos, and placed one in front of each of us. It was them, Calvin and Clayton, all smiles and company polos, posing at some team-building event. "Does anyone else know about this?" I asked, narrowing my eyes. Glenn hesitated, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. "Everyone knows," he admitted. "I thought the company had a policy against this," Wes said, leaning in, his tone sharp. "It's only a problem if someone files a complaint," Glenn explained, glancing at the door. "And even then, it's usually just a warning unless it escalates." "And if we push for more?" Wes asked, his eyes locked on Glenn. Glenn straightened in his chair, his jaw tight. "You 2 aren't planning to cause me any trouble, are you?" Wes and I exchanged a glance, no words needed. We were on the same page. "Glenn," I said, my voice firm but measured, "if those 4 are still working here next week, we're filing a lawsuit. It's your choice. We don't have all the details yet, but we have enough. Expect a call from our attorney or your legal department. Take your pick." Glenn ran a hand through his hair, eyes darting between us. "Look, I'm sorry about this situation," he said, trying to sound sincere. "No one reported anything, and since everything seemed consensual, we didn't step in. We knew something was happening, but without a formal complaint, we didn't act." "Well, now you have one," I said, standing up. fire all 4 of them, and we'll walk away quietly. But if nothing changes, we'll see you in court. And it will be very, very public. Wes and I shook Glenn's hand as we left. He tried to give us a smile, but it didn't stick. Out in the parking lot, Wes glanced at me. So, what's the next move? Lawyer first, I said. Then we grab lunch, and after that, we pay a visit to the local travel agency. We pulled into the parking lot of the law office, but before we could head inside, Wes stopped, his eyes filled with doubt. What's up? I asked, watching him closely. Mason, what exactly are we asking this lawyer to do for us? He asked, his face tight with concern. I tilted my head. What do you mean? Wes glanced at the front door of the office, his brow furrowed. Look, once we step inside, it's gonna cost us a lot. And for what? A divorce? Great. We'll be free from them, but think about it. We'll still be paying alimony, mortgage payments, child support, and half their bills. Courts will make sure we're still on the hook for everything, even cell phones and credit cards. After all that, we'll probably be on the hook for college too. And for what? To be alone and broke. I leaned against the car, rubbing the back of my neck. The only reason to even consider it is the kids, I muttered. I love my kids, Wes. I can't lose them. I hear you, man, Wes replied, his voice quieter now. If I couldn't see my girls, I'd be crushed. But it's like these laws are stacked against us. Leona cheats, but somehow I'm still the one who pays for it. It's a trap, I said, shaking my head in frustration. You either stay and deal with it or leave and lose everything. Who made these rules, Mason? Wes muttered, kicking at the gravel. How is this fair? How? We stood there for a while, just soaking in the weight of it. Finally, I spoke up. Look, Darcy's a great mom. I won't lie about that. If I had to do it on my own, I don't think I'd do half as good as she does. Yeah, Wes agreed. Leona too. As much as it hurts to say it, she's a better parent than me. My girls adore her. He shook his head, his voice heavy with bitterness. And here I am, looking like the bad guy. We didn't say much after that. We just stood there, silent, watching the world go on without us. You want to grab some ribs? Wes finally asked, glancing my way. Yeah, I said with a sigh. I could go for that. We shared a full rack, downed 3 beers each, and drowned our problems in banana pudding and strong coffee. By the time we sobered up, it was time for our next stop, Bright Horizons Travel Agency. The place was run by Nancy Raburn, an old family friend turned ex-friend. Everyone in our circle relied on Nancy to book their trips. Loyalty was the only reason she still had a business since the internet wiped out most of her competition. The moment we walked in, Nancy's face tensed up like she already knew. Her 2 junior agents exchanged glances and quickly went to lunch, leaving behind a half-eaten brown bag on one of the desks. Everyone knew. Wes and I sat down, staring at her. She tried to smile, but it didn't stick. Her fingers tapped on her desk as she squirmed in her chair. Finally, she cracked. How can I help you two today? She asked, her voice tight. Wes and I exchanged a glance and burst into laughter loud enough for the whole office to hear. I leaned forward, lowering my voice to a near whisper. You have 5 minutes to spill everything you know, or we're going to make such a scene that the cops will have to treat this place like a crime scene. Her eyes darted around the room. Come on, guys, give me a break, she pleaded. I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. You sure about that? Wes said, standing up and turning toward the entrance. The couple sitting by the brochure rack froze as Wes called out, Listen up, folks. Might want to step outside for a few minutes, 'cause things are about to get interesting in here. All right. All right. Nancy hissed, waving her hands frantically. Sit down, both of you. Just don't get me or my business in trouble. I don't need any more problems. Then answer the question, I said. Who else is with Darcy and Leona? Mason, there are over 1,000 people on that ship, she replied, feigning ignorance. You know exactly what I'm asking, I snapped. Which of their Tri-Point casualty coworkers are on that ship? Nancy pursed her lips. I can't tell you that, she said firmly. All right, then tell us this, Wes said, his tone deceptively calm. What room are Darcy and Leona staying in? Nancy squirmed. "They're in room 113 on the sunset deck," she said, her voice shaky. "That's not what I asked," I said, tapping the desk hard enough to rattle her pen. "You know exactly what I mean, Nancy." Her face twisted in frustration. "What are you trying to prove, Mason? What do you want from me?" "I want to know where Clayton Rusk and Calvin Bostic are staying," I said, leaning in, eyes locked on hers. "Tell me their room numbers." Nancy's eyes flickered to the door, but it was too late for an escape. "They're in room 115, she muttered. Wes leaned in, his voice as cold as a winter wind. "Calvin Bostic is sharing a room with my wife, Leona." Nancy's hands shook as she tried to push her chair back from the table. "Leona and Calvin are in room 113, she stammered, eyes darting between us. "And Darcy and Clayton are in 115. "But I didn't arrange it, someone else did. I just followed orders." Her eyes widened as she realized she'd said too much. Clamping her mouth shut, she handed over the reservation documents we'd requested. It was hard to tell if she was on the verge of tears or just panicking, but she kept her gaze low. As Wes and I prepared to leave, I leaned in close. "Don't call anyone. Not on the ship, not in town. If we catch wind that you tipped them off, you'll have bigger problems than us standing in your office." My tone was cold, and she knew I meant it. Once we stepped outside, Wes shook his head. "So, now what?" "Not sure yet," I admitted. "It just felt like something we had to do." Wes decided to drop off his two daughters, Lana and Miriam, with his sister Beth. She had two teenage girls of her own, so it wouldn't be much of a stretch for her to watch them for a few days. Once everything was settled on his end, Wes met me back at the house. That night, we pored over brochures, cruise schedules, and booking websites, piecing together a plan. There wasn't much doubt left, our marriages were done. There was no coming back from this. The focus shifted to our kids. We had to figure out what life would look like for them. Wes and I agreed that a messy divorce would only hurt the kids, so we decided to approach it differently. Instead of going the legal route, we'd each figure out the best way to protect our children's well-being. I had a plan forming in the back of my mind. If I played it right, I could stay with Darcy and the kids, not as her husband but as someone sharing the house for the sake of our boys. That way, I wouldn't be stuck paying for two households. I'd keep control of the finances and be in a better position to cover my boys' college costs when the time came. But that was a long-term goal. First, we had immediate problems to handle. The cruise ship offered free Wi-Fi, so Wes planned to bring his laptop. We'd download every contact possible: family, friends, coworkers, phone numbers, emails, addresses, everything. Handling cell phones would be trickier, but that would come later. According to the schedule, the ship would dock in Montego Bay on Wednesday morning. We found a sightseeing flight that would get us there by 7 a.m. It was cheap, and booking it took less than an hour. We also reserved a room on the ship under aliases for the remainder of the cruise. Later that evening, Darcy left me a message saying they'd settled into their cabin and were already at sea. She asked me to tell Wes that Leona was on board too. The casual tone in her voice was infuriating, like nothing was wrong. We spent the next day tightening up our finances. I shifted my bank accounts, bills, and credit cards to make sure nothing would blindside me later. I packed up my personal belongings and dropped them off at my parents' house for safekeeping. Wes did the same, having his brother take care of his things. A coworker of mine agreed to let us park our cars at his house, and he gave us a ride to the airport. We left just after midnight. The flight was smooth, and by sunrise, we were in Jamaica. The airport was only a short taxi ride from the cruise ship's port. We traveled light, 2 carry-on bags and Wes's laptop. We didn't plan on dressing up, so we packed only essentials. As the sun crept over the market stalls, we watched passengers disembark. Some headed into town, while most boarded neatly lined up tour buses. Everything moved like clockwork, like it had been done 100 times before. And there they were. Darcy and Leona walked off the ship, beaming with wide smiles. 2 men trailed behind them, their hands intertwined with our wives' hands. I didn't need a second look to know who they were: Clayton Rusk and Calvin Bostic. They were younger than Wes and me, but they didn't have the grit of men who'd done hard work. The sight made me feel hollow inside. Wes and I sat on a couple of small stools, sipping from cold soda cans, blending in with the other tourists. We watched as the 4 of them boarded a bus to Dunn's River Falls. "Time to move," Wes muttered. He greeted the ticket collector with a smile, slipped the bus driver some cash, and explained what we needed. Jamaicans are known for their negotiating skills, so it took 5 minutes and $200 before they agreed to our plan. Our instructions were clear: take as many pictures as possible of the two couples at the falls. If he could catch them in more intimate moments, he'd get a bonus. The driver flashed a grin, gave us a thumbs up, and even bragged about the quality of his camera. He also hinted he'd need another $200 for special photos. I didn't care. I handed him the money. With the bus gone, we boarded the ship and headed straight for the check-in desk. Another $100 later, we were registered as Bob Jones and James Moore, officially on board. We didn't waste time settling in. Instead, we grabbed a couple of sandwiches and spent the next 2 hours mapping out the ship. We memorized every stairwell, every elevator, every passageway. We avoided the dining room and showroom, places Darcy and Leona would likely frequent. Wes set up his laptop in our cabin and confirmed we had steady internet access. For a moment, we considered breaking into Darcy's and Leona's rooms but decided it wasn't worth it. Patience would pay off. That afternoon, we found seats near the port entrance, waiting for the buses to return. We sipped on 2 glasses of Red Label and waited. At exactly 3 o'clock, the bus from Dunn's River Falls pulled up. Darcy, Leona, Clayton, and Calvin strolled off like they'd just stepped out of a vacation ad. Sunburned cheeks, loose-limbed smiles, and that glow people get after a day of adventure. Darcy looked so happy it made me feel sick. Our ticket collector approached, grinning like a man who'd just won the lottery. "You're gonna love these," he said, flipping through the photos on his phone. Wes handed him a cold beer before he could start boasting. We scanned the images, our jaws tightening with every swipe. There was more hand-holding, cuddling, and kissing than we'd expected. Some shots were more brazen than I thought possible. I handed him another $200 and an extra $100 for the driver. "Worth every penny," I muttered. We waited until Darcy, Leona, and their companions were gone before heading back to our cabin. There was still work to do. We sat on our balcony, which had a clear view of the entrance to the main dining hall. It wasn't long before couples started lining up for dinner. "Bet they show up early so they can hit the dance floor later," Wes said, taking a sip from his glass. Sure enough, we spotted them. Clayton and Calvin strolled in like they'd been doing it for years, hand in hand with Darcy and Leona. They weren't just holding hands, they looked like couples. Wes raised an eyebrow at me, clearly thinking the same thing. I didn't say a word. Instead, I stood up and walked to the service phone in our cabin. I made a call, grinning as I returned to my chair. "Wait for it," I said, keeping my eyes on the dining hall. Just as they reached the front of the line, the intercom buzzed with a clear, crisp announcement. "Attention, Wes Dorman, please join your party on the Leo deck. Wes Dorman, please join your party on the Leo deck." The dining hall went still for a second. Then Leona's head whipped around like she'd been yanked by a hook. She nudged Darcy, and both women exchanged frantic glances. Clayton and Calvin stood frozen, clueless but patient. "Look at them," Wes said, leaning forward. "They're trying so hard to act normal." Leona pulled Darcy aside, whispering fast and urgent. They glanced up, scanning the room. "Welcome to the show, ladies," I muttered, tilting my glass toward them. "Welcome to the show." Nancy's warning about who arranged the rooms echoed in my mind as we watched Leona pull out her phone. Her fingers moved fast as she hit one of her speed dial contacts. After about 30 seconds, she shook her head, glancing at Darcy with a look that said, "No answer." Darcy pulled out her own phone, made a call, and got the same result. Both of them exchanged worried glances before heading into the dining room. "That was brilliant," Wes said with a chuckle, leaning back in his chair. "I would pay good money to hear the conversation they're having right now. I bet it's priceless." I grinned, and we both let out quiet laughs before heading to the sunset deck for tacos and margaritas. We kept the mood light for about an hour, but there was work to be done. Back in our cabin, we got serious. Tomorrow, the ship would dock in Cancun, and we needed to be ready. Nobody back home knew where we were, not our parents, not our friends, and definitely not our wives. Even if they tried calling, they'd hit dead ends. The first order of business was transferring all the photos from Dunn's River Falls to Wes's laptop. There were plenty of shots of the 4 of them together, but the most useful images focused on Darcy and Leona with their companions, Clayton and Calvin. Some of the pictures were tame, just friendly smiles, but a few captured more intimate moments. Darcy's new orange bikini, the one I'd found in her makeup bag, was on full display, and thanks to a minor wardrobe malfunction, she spent half the time giggling as she tried to fix it. A video would have been gold, but we made do with what we had. Wes got to work creating a collage, pulling a dozen of the clearest, most damning shots. The final page featured each of the four in various states of affection. We each picked a favorite shot, and Wes placed it front and center. Then, we got creative. By 9 o'clock, we had sent out over 200 emails. The message? A simple, friendly e-card with the caption, "Having a great time, wish you were here." Attached were the collage and photos of the happy couples. Naturally, every employee at Tri-Point Casualty got a copy, along with family, friends, and just about anyone in our contact lists. After the work was done, we headed to the sky deck. It was practically deserted, with only the wind for company. We found a secluded spot, cracked open 3 long-necked beers each, and toasted to a successful day. We didn't know what the next move was, but since the e-card trick had gone so well, we figured we'd do it again tomorrow. The next morning, we woke up early and grabbed breakfast, fresh fruit, danishes, and coffee. We avoided the main dining room and stuck to quieter, less crowded spots. No elevators, just stairwells. We weren't taking chances. By late morning, we were on the sun deck, lounging with rum drinks in hand. From our spot, we had a clear view of the pool. It was filling up fast, people laying towels on chairs and splashing in the water. Darcy and Leona appeared soon after, settling into 2 chairs by the pool. But oddly enough, there was no sign of Clayton or Calvin. "Where do you think they went?" Wes muttered, scanning the deck. "Don't know, don't care," I replied, taking a sip of my drink. "But let's have some fun." At the far end of the deck, a teenage boy was glued to his phone, texting at lightning speed. I nudged Wes, and we made our way over. Approaching a teenager on a cruise without looking suspicious is harder than it sounds, but we pulled it off. For $20, the kid agreed to let us make a quick call. I punched in Darcy's number. "Hello," she answered, her voice casual but curious. "Hey, Darcy." "It's Mason," I said, letting a hint of surprise enter my voice. "Sorry I missed your call last night." I tried calling home 3 times, but nobody answered. There was a brief pause. "Mason, this call's showing as coming from Baltimore," she said, her voice sharp with confusion. "Yeah, had to borrow this phone." "You know I can't call from mine," I replied smoothly. "Everything okay? Your parents didn't know where you were." Her tone shifted. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just busy," she answered quickly. "We're having a great time. Too bad you couldn't join us." Her voice sounded lighter, more relaxed. "Yeah, I bet," I said, letting out a short laugh. "Hey, by the way, that orange bikini? Looks great on you. Never seen it before." Silence. "What?" Darcy blurted, her voice sharp, panicked. I grinned wide as I ended the call, handing the phone back to the teen. Wes and I burst into laughter, wiping tears from our eyes. I handed the kid another $20 and told him, "Don't say a word about this to anyone." He nodded, wide-eyed. "This is awesome," he said, slipping the cash into his pocket. We watched from afar as Darcy and Leona became visibly agitated. Darcy pulled her towel up over her head, clearly trying to go unnoticed. They searched the deck, their eyes darting around like prey sensing a predator. Darcy called the number we'd used, twice, but nobody answered. About 15 minutes later, Clayton and Calvin reappeared. Wes got up, wandered over to the service phone, and returned with a grin on his face. "Attention, Wes Dorman, please join your group at the shuffleboard court. Wes Dorman, please join your group at the shuffleboard court." There was a flurry of activity. Leona and Darcy jumped up, hurriedly grabbing their bags. They hustled toward the shuffleboard court, glancing around like spies on the run. Clayton and Calvin just stood there, looking annoyed. Wes leaned on the railing, shaking his head. "Half an hour they're gonna wait there. Bet on it." And that's exactly what happened. Darcy and Leona hung around for 30 minutes, pacing like lost tourists, before heading back toward the cabin deck. As they walked, Darcy pulled out her phone. By the look on her face, she'd seen the e-cards. Think she's calling her mom or one of her sisters, I said, watching her. No point, though. Everyone she calls has seen it already. We sat back and watched the afternoon roll by. When dinner rolled around, Clayton and Calvin showed up at the dining room without Darcy or Leona. The two men spent the night drinking at the cabaret bar on the lagoon deck. We followed them at a distance, grabbing beer and pizza from a quiet corner. Think they'll talk about it? Wes asked, nodding toward the two men. Maybe, but I doubt they'll say anything useful, I replied, taking a long sip. The night ended with both Calvin and Clayton so drunk they had to be escorted back to their cabins by the crew. We watched it all unfold, unseen from the shadows. The next morning, we were on the sun deck, eating fruit and drinking coffee as the ship pulled into Cancun. Crowds gathered on the promenade deck, waiting to disembark. We hadn't figured out our plan for the day, but it didn't matter. Darcy and Leona were among the first to leave the ship, luggage in hand. That's not a day trip, Wes muttered, watching them. Nope, I agreed. They're gone. While the other tourists lined up for tour buses, Darcy and Leona hailed a cab and disappeared into the distance. They didn't look back. Clayton and Calvin left too, boarding a tour bus bound for a nearby resort. Well, that changes things, Wes muttered, tapping the table. With most passengers ashore, the ship felt calmer. We had a long lunch in the dining room and talked about strategy. There was still one more stop before heading back to Grand Cayman. We weren't done yet. That evening, we spotted Clayton and Calvin in the dining room, sitting at a table for four. 2 seats were empty. Wes and I exchanged glances. No words were needed. We walked in, took the 2 empty seats, and leaned back as if we'd been invited. Calvin glanced up, giving a nod, while Clayton's face tightened in annoyance. Good evening, gentlemen, I said with a smile. I assume you know who we are. Calvin's nod was slow and deliberate. Clayton? He didn't say a word, but his eyes were filled with rage. Calvin's unease was written all over his face, while Clayton's irritation was plain as day. His jaw was tight, and his eyes locked on me with barely concealed contempt. Gentlemen, I said, leaning back casually in my chair. Mr. Dorman and I won't be joining you for dinner. With only 3 days left on this cruise, we figured it'd be wise to offer you a little friendly advice. From the corner of my eye, I saw Wes trying to hold back a grin. I kept my gaze on Calvin and Clayton. Calvin's brow furrowed with interest, while Clayton clenched his fists on the table. Did you know, I continued, that an average of 222 people go overboard on cruises every year, and they're never found? The table went quiet. I let that number hang in the air for a moment, watching it sink in. Then Wes and I both stood, calmly pushing in our chairs. Stay safe, fellas, I added, nodding toward them before we walked away. We didn't look back, but I heard Calvin talking in a hushed, frantic tone as we left the dining room. His words were too low to catch, but the tension was unmistakable. We opted for tacos and beer that night. The wind outside was too strong for the deck, so we stayed indoors, eating by a window with a view of the sunset. The amber glow over the ocean was stunning, casting streaks of gold and orange across the water. That was a bold move back there, Mason, Wes said, still smirking. Not sure what your goal was, but you definitely got their attention. Honestly? I'm not sure either, I admitted, sipping my beer. Let's regroup tomorrow and figure out our next move. But tomorrow came earlier than expected. Gentlemen, I'm Mr. Sorensen. May I have a moment of your time? The voice was deep and steady, and when we turned, we saw an imposing crewman with 2 silent attendants at his sides. Nordic-looking, tall, broad shoulders, and an air of absolute control. Wes and I shared a glance, both of us already grinning. We nodded in unison. Am I speaking to Mr. Jones and Mr. Moore? Sorensen asked, his eyes sharp as a hawk, or to Mr. Dorman and Mr. Mollis? I sighed, waving off the game. Dorman and Mollis, I admitted. No point in lying now. Some passengers reported that you threatened to throw them overboard, Sorensen said bluntly. Care to explain that accusation? We didn't threaten them, I replied, keeping my voice calm. We just shared a maritime statistic. Did you know that 222 people go overboard every year? We thought it'd be good advice for them to be careful. Don't play games with me, Sorensen shot back, his eyes narrowing. You know exactly what you were doing. Why would we do something like that? Wes asked, feigning shock. His voice was pure innocence. Sorensen didn't buy it. He gestured toward a quieter section of the lounge, and we followed. The two attendants stayed back, arms folded like statues. "Gentlemen," Sorensen began, his voice low but firm, "did you threaten Mr. Bostic and Mr. Rusk?" Wes and I exchanged a glance, silently coming to an agreement. "Yes," I admitted. "We did." Sorensen raised a brow. "Care to explain why?" I leaned forward, locking eyes with him. "I think you already know. In fact, you played a part in it." He tilted his head, his eyes narrowing like he was trying to read my mind. "Go on." "Nordic Cruise Lines arranged for Mr. Bostic and Mr. Rusk to share staterooms with our wives," I explained slowly, watching every twitch of his face. "Calvin Bostic was paired with Leona Dorman, and Clayton Rusk was paired with Darcy Mollis. To us, it looks like Nordic Cruise Lines is running a cruise for housewives seeking boyfriends. And while I'm sure you have the legal fine print to protect yourselves, it doesn't make it any less disgusting." Sorensen's face shifted slightly. He looked more irritated than shocked. "Mr. Mollis," he said with practiced patience, "I understand your frustration with your wife's choices, but surely you don't believe the cruise line is in the business of encouraging infidelity. We're a family-oriented company, and we take that reputation very seriously. Is that so?" I said, leaning back with a smirk. "Then I'm sure you'll have no issue defending that claim in front of a few TV cameras." Sorensen's jaw tightened, but he kept his cool. "Regrettably, we'll need to document this matter for the proper authorities. They may have questions for you." "Which authorities?" Wes asked, his grin widening. "Aren't you the authority on this ship?" "Mr. Mollis, Mr. Dorman," Sorensen said, his tone firm now, "I need you to promise that you'll avoid any further interaction with Mr. Bostic and Mr. Rusk for the rest of this cruise. Can you assure me of that?" "Absolutely," I replied, all smiles. "You've got our word." He didn't look convinced, but he signaled for his attendants, and they walked away together. Wes and I sat there for a moment, savoring the quiet victory. "Let's send a few more emails," Wes said, grinning. We spent the night drafting press releases and emails to every media outlet we could think of. We didn't hold back. We may have gone overboard, no pun intended, by claiming Nancy Raburn at Bright Horizons Travel was arranging escapade cruises for married women. But it felt justified at the time. Among the 32 press releases, we sent 2 directly to Piccolo World Tours, the parent company for Nancy's travel agency. We knew the tabloids wouldn't print all of it, but some of it. Oh, some of it would make it to the surface. The next morning, Wes and I had breakfast on the Leo deck. As we sat drinking coffee, Wes checked his phone. "One missed call," he said, eyes narrowing as he scrolled. "It's from my dad." I checked my phone too. "One missed call from my father." I stepped aside and dialed back. "Dad? It's Mason. I saw you called. What's going on?" His sigh came heavy through the phone. "Son, I assume you know more about this than I do. All I know is that Darcy showed up on Wednesday and took the boys with her." I stopped cold. "She what?" "You asked me not to let her take them," he said, sounding disappointed. "But, son, I'm not going to wrestle your wife in front of the boys. She packed them up and left in a hurry." I leaned against the railing, feeling my chest tighten. "Did she say where she was going?" "Not exactly," my dad replied. "But I heard her say something to Jalen about Noble's Grove, and it seemed to cheer him up. You know how much he loves that place." "Noble's Grove?" "Of course. It was a lakeside cabin community where Darcy's sister owned a timeshare. She'd taken the boys there for spring break a couple of times. It made sense. She was probably hiding out there." I hung up and called Wes over. "They took the kids, man," I said, voice low but tight. "She's holed up at Noble's Grove." Wes cursed under his breath, gripping the back of a chair. "So, what now?" "We're going home," I replied, already thinking ahead. "We go home, and we end this." We docked at Grand Cayman later that morning. As passengers gathered to disembark, I spotted breakfast trays stacked outside Calvin and Clayton's cabins. Neither of them had come out. When we finally saw Calvin, he was rolling his luggage toward the ramp. He didn't just leave the ship for a tour, he left for good. No sign of Clayton. I briefly considered that Clayton might have left the ship after us, but I doubted it. He wasn't the type to slink away quietly. Meanwhile, Wes had been busy checking his email. We've got over 30 responses to the e-cards, Wes said, scrolling through his inbox. Most of them think it's hilarious. But, he glanced up at me with a wry smile. Not everyone's laughing. Let me guess, family? I said, already knowing the answer. Yup. Siblings, cousins, and a few aunts who think we're despicable and petty. He snorted a laugh. But you know what? I don't care. We didn't send it for them. He was right. We didn't. The people we did send it for had definitely gotten the message. Some of the replies were pure comedy. Friends, old college buddies, and even a few coworkers replied with gifs, memes, and laughing emojis. It felt good to know the right people had seen it. Darcy and Leona? Not a single message. Not a peep. That night, knowing we'd be back home the next day, we made sure to fully charge our phones before bed. There would be no missed calls or I didn't see it excuses. Before we called it a night, we sent out 32 press releases, even though we had no clue how to properly format them or who to send them to. 2 of those press releases went straight to Piccolo World Tours, the parent company of Bright Horizons travel agency, just to make sure Nancy Raburn got a taste of the chaos. We might have gone too far with the accusation that Nancy was organizing escapade cruises for married housewives and their boyfriends, but at that point, we didn't care. She played a role, and we made sure she felt it. By the time our heads hit the pillows, the wheels were already in motion. The next morning, news trickled in that our story had hit newspapers, gossip blogs, and a few TV exposé shows. Our inboxes were blowing up. People were talking. It had been a good day. The next morning, Wes and I had breakfast on the Leo deck, the sun bright and warm as it broke over the water. It was quiet. Peaceful. The kind of peace you only get after dropping a grenade and walking away from the explosion. We ate slowly, knowing it would be one of the last moments of calm before reality came rushing back in. Once we finished eating, Wes turned on his phone. The moment he did, it buzzed with missed notifications. Missed call from my brother, he said, frowning. Yours ringing yet? I checked my phone. 1 missed call from my dad. My heart sank. I stepped away from the crowd, pressed call back, and waited. He picked up on the second ring. Hey, Dad. It's Mason, I said, trying to sound normal. Saw you tried to call. What's going on? There was a pause on the line. Then he sighed. Well, son, I assume you know more about this than I do, he said, his voice tinged with quiet frustration. More about what? I asked, already dreading the answer. All I know is Darcy showed up on Wednesday and took the boys with her. I stopped walking, gripping the railing of the ship. She took the boys? I asked, my voice rising. Yeah, my dad said slowly. You told me not to let her take them, but son. I'm not about to physically stop her. She packed them up, and it looked like she was in a rush. Jalen didn't look too happy about it. She said it was urgent and she didn't plan on staying long. I squeezed my eyes shut, my mind racing. Did she tell you where she was going? No, but I caught something, he said, his voice quieter now. When they were leaving, I heard her mention Noble's Grove. Wes and I sat in the dim light of the Leo lounge, sipping on our 3rd beers of the night. The ship swayed lightly, and we watched tired passengers shuffle back and forth, eager to disembark. Somewhere in that crowd, Clayton was likely among them, but we didn't spot him. The bartender, friendly as ever, wiped down the counter and gave us a heads up. Lounge is closing soon, gentlemen. We nodded, downed the last of our beers, and made our way back to the stateroom. But the moment we got there, something was off. Our luggage was already packed and sitting in the aisle outside the room. We exchanged a glance just as a crew member approached. Authorities will be meeting you regarding your behavior during the cruise, he said, his tone official but not hostile. We looked at each other, confused. What authorities? Nobody was there to escort us off the ship, and no one approached us as we disembarked the next morning. No reporters. No media. No big moment. Nothing. It was disappointing, to say the least. We boarded the airport limo van, snagging the last 2 seats, and the ride to the airport was quiet. Booking a one-way, last-minute flight home had drained our wallets, but we had no choice. We sat in silence for most of the flight. Wes kept staring out the window, lost in thought. Both of us had started this mission with plans, bold ideas of how things would play out. But now, as we sat on that plane, it was obvious those plans had unraveled. Wes still had his daughters, but his wife had vanished. Me? I had neither kids nor wife to come home to. When I walked into my house, the silence hit me harder than I'd expected. No sounds of the boys playing video games, no sounds of Darcy humming while folding laundry. Just stillness. I checked my phone. No messages. No calls. I tried calling Darcy's workplace, but the receptionist informed me she no longer worked at Tri-Point Casualty. My guess? Calvin, Clayton, Darcy, and Leona were all fired. The next morning, I started cleaning the house. I boxed up Darcy's leftover belongings, tossing anything that seemed like it didn't belong. Wes called later to say his wife Leona had pulled a vanishing act, too. She'd stopped by his sister's house to thank her for watching the kids, then packed her car with clothes and disappeared. She didn't even take the kids with her. She just left. Mason, Wes muttered, his voice tired. Left the girls with Beth. Didn't say where she was going. I shook my head, not even surprised anymore. Sounds like we're living the same story. Darcy cleaned out her closet and took the boys' clothes with her. I think she went to her sister's place in Mount Carmel, but I'm not sure. For a while, we sat in silence. Wes glanced at me through the phone. I know it's early, but I could really use a beer. Yeah, I muttered. Same. The rest of the cruise had been pointless, but it wasn't all bad. We sent out press releases to media outlets, accusing Nancy Raburn and her travel agency of booking escapade cruises for married housewives. We even sent 2 releases to Piccolo World Tours, the company that owned the agency. Some gossip sites picked up on it, and a few TV exposé shows ran short segments. Most of it fizzled out, but that wasn't the point. The right people saw it. 2 weeks after I got home, I called Loretta, Darcy's sister. She stayed here for one night, Loretta told me, her voice stiff. Then she left. Didn't say where she was going. You sure about that? I pressed, knowing full well she was holding something back. I'm sure, Mason, she said firmly. I'd tell you if I knew more. It didn't feel right, but what could I do? No sense grilling her any further. 6 weeks later, I went by the boys' old school to make sure their records had been transferred. The woman at the front desk smiled brightly. Oh, yes, she said, clicking away at her keyboard. The records were sent 2 weeks ago to North Shockhill Elementary in Frackville. All set. Frackville? I repeated, my heart dropping. She moved them out of town. She beamed, proud of her efficiency. Yup. Everything's in order. That's when I knew I had to call her. I dug up Darcy's new cell number and called 3 times before she finally picked up. Caller ID had her dodging me at first, but I stayed persistent. Hello? She answered, her voice defensive. It's Mason, I said bluntly. We need to talk. Silence. Fine, she muttered. Where? The food court at Frackville Mall, I replied. 30 minutes. She showed up 40 minutes later. By the time she sat down, my coffee had gone cold. She didn't get anything to drink, just sat down across from me, her hands resting on the table. No hello. No how are you? I broke the silence. I want you and the boys to move back into the house. Her eyes narrowed, skeptical. All of us together? No, I said flatly. Just you and the boys. I'll stay at a small apartment nearby. The boys can go back to their old school, and I'll be close enough to see them regularly. Her brow furrowed. I can't afford that. I don't make enough for rent, utilities, food. I'll pay for all of it, I interrupted. I'll cover rent, utilities, groceries, school costs, and clothing for the boys. I leaned forward, making sure she understood. You, Darcy, are a grown woman. I'm done carrying you. Get a job that fits the boys' school schedule or work evenings. I'm sure you'll figure it out. She scanned my face, looking for a way to argue. Her eyes shifted like she was weighing the pros and cons. Finally, she nodded. All right, she said. For the boys. I stood, placing my empty cup on the table. I'll move out in a few days. You can move in whenever you're ready. Anything else you want to say? She asked as I turned to leave. I glanced back and saw her eyes glistening with tears. I didn't say a word, 6 months later, I had the boys every weekend. Darcy found a job with flexible hours, and it seemed to be working. Things with Wes were different. We drifted apart. He still had his daughters, but I had nothing but an apartment and quiet nights eating microwave dinners. Then came the day everything fell apart. I walked into my office after lunch and froze. Reed and Jalen were sitting in the waiting area, their backpacks at their feet. "What are you doing here?" I asked, stunned. "Why aren't you in school?" "The furnace broke," Jalen muttered, eyes on his shoes. "They sent everyone home." "Okay," I said, taking a breath. "When did you get here?" "We went home first," Reed replied. "Then we came here." The key was under the mat. Something wasn't right. They avoided my eyes, staring at the floor. "What's wrong?" I pressed, my eyes bouncing between them. "Tell me." Jalen hesitated, his face pale. "When we got home, Mom's bedroom door was open." I stood still, listening. "She was in there with a man," Jalen added, his voice shaking. I felt my heart drop. "Who?" "Clayton," Jalen whispered. "They didn't have clothes on." I didn't have to ask for more. Jalen pulled out his phone, handing it to me. "Photos." It only took one glance to confirm it. "Mom said if we told you, we'd have to move back to Frackville," Reed said quietly. "Not happening," I muttered, already planning my next move. I packed the boys' clothes. Darcy walked in as I loaded the last bag. "Where do you think you're going?" she demanded, hands on her hips. "The boys are leaving with me," I replied calmly. "If you want them back, take me to court." Her face twisted with rage, but I stayed firm. I leaned in. "Oh, and Darcy? The furnace broke at school today. That's how the boys got home early." Her face went pale. I picked up the last bag. "Jalen took pictures," I said calmly. "Clayton's gonna need health insurance." Her eyes were hollow as I walked out. I didn't slam the door. Didn't have to. We bought a small trailer and never looked back.